Hello and welcome to Presentation 1 for SPED 625 in Module 3. In this module, we will discuss federal settings and special education services. You will learn how to consider and calculate federal settings. We will discuss how you document special education services, and we will examine LRE requirements. Some of the documents you may wish to reference during this presentation include the blank IEP, your own copies of IEPs if you wish, this is not required, and the LRE document from PACER. Federal settings and least restrictive environment. Let's take a look at all of the different federal settings that exist with Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We have federal settings 1 through 8. Some are more common than others. Let's break that down a little bit. The federal setting refers to the percentage of the day that a student is in a special education setting or outside the general education setting. So how do you determine the actual minutes that are required? On a basic note, you get out your calculator and you do some math. Although that's true, we will cover that piece in a few slides. So let's look at these federal settings. Federal setting 1 is going to take place in a typical school, as will federal setting 2. That's always going to be in a typical school. So if you think about federal setting 1 and 2, our charter schools will always be able to serve settings 1 and 2, and then any other public school will be able to serve settings 1 and 2. Setting 3, although commonly in a typical school, it's not in every typical school because depending on the size of the school, a school will not be able to provide enough staff to cover the needs of setting 3. So if you have a smaller school, you might have 2 students who require setting 3 services. You are not going to build a setting 3 program for only 2 students. Those students have a right to services, so they will go to their nearest school that provides setting 3 services. In rural or greater Minnesota, that may actually be quite a distance away, and that will require potentially a long bus ride. A school district is allowed to do that, provided they can show the family that they are doing the best they can to serve the appropriate services, to provide the appropriate services. Setting 4 is going to be in a separate day school, so a separate public school. For example, Minneapolis, Anoka Hennepin, St. Paul, those school districts are large enough that they have their own setting 4 programs. I'm sure there are others, those are just the most common. If a school district does not have their own setting 4 program that is in a separate public school, they may often access intermediate school districts. So for example, here in the metro, we have ISD 916, ISD 917, and Intermediate District 287. I may have those numbers wrong. It may be 197 and 196. Still, other districts will need to bus their students, as I mentioned earlier, in greater Minnesota, rural Minnesota. Another example would be if you have a student in the Osseo School District that needs one of these intermediate districts and the one closest to them is full, they may need to access one that is a half-hour, 45-minute drive away because they need the services. And again, that is allowed because the district is able to prove to the state that we don't have something closer. So that is always allowed as long as you provide the appropriate setting for the student. The district would be required for all payment related to that setting. Another example, if a student is in the Osseo district and has to go over to 916, and let's say it's a 45-minute drive, the district is required to provide transportation, and the district will be required to pay 916 all of the services that the student needs. Setting 5 As is the case with all settings, this is determined by the IEP team and based on student need. So you can see Federal Setting 5 is a separate private school. You may think, well, why would we pay for a separate private school when we have all of the appropriate public schools? In some cases, it can be determined that a private school is the most appropriate setting. If we think of our deaf, hard of hearing students who may benefit from Faribault Deaf and Hard of Hearing School more than they would benefit from having an interpreter in their current school. So those are decisions that the IEP team makes, and that's why separate private school is sometimes an option. In rare occasions, if there has been a lawsuit of some sort or compensatory payment that's required on the part of the school district may choose a private school that will benefit the family in order for their student to get the services that the district originally did not provide. Then we move to Federal Setting 6, which is public residential. That is going to be similar to a juvenile detention center. It would be a correctional facility of some sort. It would be public, but it is where the student would actually reside and go to school at the same time. Private residential, Federal Setting 7, is going to be more along the lines of drug and rehab settings, potentially for sexual disorders. Those are definitely more rare. And Federal Setting 8 is actually fairly common, so don't always think of the higher the setting, the least common, would be hospital or homebound. So think about our students who may be dealing with a health issue such as cancer or AIDS or something where they're hospitalized for long amounts of time, but they require special ed services. Their special ed IEP would become a Setting 8, and they would receive their services in that setting. Mental health needs are also a common one where they might go to Children's Hospital in Minneapolis, and they might be there for a 30-day placement. The Minneapolis Public Schools provide the services in that hospital setting, and then the school district where the student normally resides would pay Minneapolis for those services. This is a lot to take in, so please post any questions related to this in the coffee shop forum. Restrictive environment and federal setting. So how do we take the federal how do we determine the federal settings? We have to think about what IDEA tells us about least restrictive environment. I want you to reference your LRE PACER document that was provided in Moodle for additional information. For the purposes of this presentation, let's break down the two important components. Little I1, little Roman numeral 1 on this talks about, to the maximum extent appropriate, children with disabilities are educated with children who are non-disabled. So if we think about that settings chart, settings 1 and 2 are going to be their least restrictive because they are with students who are non-disabled for most of the day. Roman numeral 2, special classes, separate schooling, or other removal of children with disabilities from the regular educational environment occurs only if the nature or severity of the disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. And that's when we start to consider those higher settings, settings 3 and 4. Keep in mind this statement that talks about the use of supplementary aids and services. So we have to consider, does a para supporting the student mean they can be in a general ed classroom longer? Do they need assistive technology in order to stay in the regular ed classroom? All of those pieces play a role in determining the setting for the student. We will get into the supplementary aids piece in the second presentation of this module. So to break this down a little bit more, this is an IEP team decision. It is not you, the case manager, making the decision alone. It is the IEP team. The district representative plays a role in this. The parents play a role. The general education teacher plays a role. Everyone comes together to determine the appropriate setting. This is also where you address the students' participation with their non-disabled peers. When will they be with their non-disabled peers? We should always assume they will be with non-disabled peers unless we have reason to believe they can't. The federal setting ultimately must match the minutes in the special education and related services section of the IEP, and they should match the LRE justification. Calculate the federal setting. First, you get out your calculator and you figure these pieces out. You need to know the total number of minutes in a typical school week. Let's use 1,800 minutes as an example. Next, the IEP team needs to decide, based on the student's special education and related service needs, how many minutes a week the student will receive services outside of the general education setting. That is how the federal setting is determined. So let's see it in action. Ying receives special ed instruction in reading 3 times a week for 30 minutes each session. That's 90 minutes a week. 90 out of 1,800 minutes is 5%. If that is the only service she requires, she would be in setting 1. Let's try another one. Josiah receives special education instruction in reading 2 times a week for 30 minutes each session, and math 3 times a week for 30 minutes each session, and social skills 5 times a week for 50 minutes each session. So you're going to add up all of those minutes because they are away from non-disabled peers. That's going to give you your total minutes per week. You divide that from 1,800 and that will give you your federal setting. So what about IEPs that have indirect minutes listed on them? Indirect services mean someone is doing something related to the service, but it is not directly with the student. Indirect minutes are not required to be on an IEP, but your district may choose to include it. Some examples of these include an occupational therapist. The OT may not need to spend direct time with a student. Instead, the OT may simply need to provide direction or consultation to the case manager or the general ed teacher on what tools to use with the student and how to use them. In this case, we want to make sure indirect minutes are listed to ensure that all people involved are aware of this need. Reading instruction is another example. If the reading instruction happens in the general ed setting with support from a para, which those pieces would be direct services, the indirect minutes may relate to the case manager discussing the student's needs once a week with the teacher. So for example, if I go back to Ying may get support from a para for 30 minutes every day of the week in the general ed setting. That is going to be a direct service. The indirect part of this would be, if I'm the case manager, I'm going to talk with the general ed teacher once a week to see how things are going. I'm still going to talk with the general ed teacher even if indirect minutes are not on there, but sometimes it's a way to just show a family, show the parents how they can be assured that I am talking to the general ed teacher. So that's why it isn't a requirement, but some districts choose to use this because it just communicates a little bit more on when and how things are being discussed. This is not something you need to spend a lot of time on. It is simply a mechanism to use if you want to make it obvious you are expecting some indirect time for the student. Look at the chart that would be similar to the one in the blank IEP. So the services in the IEP are going to look different in every district. It depends on the software used. This is just one example. So first we have a statement of the service. So this service is something that must enable the child to advance toward their goals. It's based on peer-reviewed research whenever possible, which means if we're going to do small group instruction, we know that research tells us small group instruction is going to help our students progress. If we have a para included in this section, research would tell us that an additional support in a general ed classroom is going to be beneficial for the student. So you're not actually listing what the peer-reviewed research is. It's just that good teaching, good planning should always be based on peer-reviewed research. The start date and the frequency per week or month or other is required by IDEA. The minutes per session for the services contributes to calculating the LRE and federal setting. This enables the district to seek reimbursement from other agencies when possible. The location of it contributes to calculating the LRE and federal setting, and then the anticipated duration is required by IDEA. We're going to look at a sample of what this looks like in just a moment. Here's an example of a good LRE statement. So depending on the IEP you're looking at, the LRE statement may be in any number of places. You simply need to find where it's listed in the IEP you're doing. If you're using due process software, it's going to force you to fill this out. The team has determined that the least restrictive setting for Joe is in the regular education classroom with support. This will allow Joe to participate with his non-disabled peers. Joe has a severe learning disability in reading, and he needs intense, direct, small group instruction in the area of reading, as well as minor adaptations on curriculum which he will get within the regular education classroom through the special education teacher. This is a Federal 1 setting. Of service. So for Joe, one part of the IEP may look like this. Because he gets some additional support in the classroom, we would list it as reading para support. He's going to start this on September 6th. He's going to do this 5 days a week. Each day, the para will support him 30 minutes directly, and we're going to also provide 10 minutes of indirect service, which means the case manager will talk to the general ed teacher or even the para 10 minutes a week. The location is general education. The anticipated duration is 1 year. If we added a second row here, we would say reading services 5 days a week, and we might put 60 minutes because we could see in that LRE statement that his learning disability it's intense enough in the area of reading that he needs some small group instruction as well. That means the location will say special education. So there can be several types of services directly related to reading, but you can see how they would change depending on what is being provided. That ends the LRE and federal settings section. Please be sure to post any questions in the coffee shop forum, as others will also benefit from your question and the response from the instructor. Thank you.